Bullied and humiliated every day, Lucas stumbles upon a secret MMA gym where an ex-fighter takes him under his wing. But when he finally faces his tormentor in a brutal fight, he realizes the real battle isn't against his enemy, it's against himself. Lucas pulled his hoodie over his head, hoping to disappear into the background of the crowded school cafeteria. The steady hum of laughter and conversation filled the air, but he wasn't part of it. He never was. He clutched his tray tightly, scanning the room for a quiet spot where he could eat in peace. Before he could move, a familiar voice cut through the noise like a knife. Well, look who's here. The cafeteria must be running out of food." Laughter erupted around him. Lucas froze, his stomach clenched. Bruno. Tall, broad-shouldered, and always surrounded by his pack of friends, Bruno was the self-proclaimed king of the school. He thrived on humiliating others, and Lucas had become his favorite target. Bruno stepped closer, his smirk widening. "What's on the menu today, Chubby? Gonna eat all that by yourself?" Lucas lowered his gaze, willing himself to stay silent. He knew that answering would only make things worse. But Bruno wasn't finished. With a quick flick of his wrist, he slapped Lucas's tray, sending food splattering across his shirt. Gasps and laughter filled the cafeteria. Someone whistled, others cheered. Lucas stood frozen, heart hammering against his ribs. Heat rushed to his face. The smell of mashed potatoes and gravy clung to his clothes. He heard whispers, saw amused glances. His body screamed at him to run, but his feet remained glued to the floor. Bruno leaned in, voice dripping with mock concern. "Oops, guess you won't be needing that." The cafeteria buzzed with cruel amusement as Bruno and his friends sauntered away, slapping each other on the back, already moving on to their next joke. Lucas felt his hands trembling. He clenched them into fists. The humiliation burned deeper than any words could. He wanted to disappear, to erase this moment from existence. But beneath the shame, another emotion flickered, one he hadn't felt in a long time. Anger. It simmered quietly, buried beneath layers of self-doubt and fear. But it was there, a small ember waiting to catch fire. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the restroom, his shirt still stained with food. Each step felt heavier than the last. When he reached the sink, he gripped its edge and stared at his reflection. Pale skin, round face, eyes filled with something between sadness and fury. He had spent years letting people like Bruno define him, letting their words and actions chip away at his confidence until nothing was left but silence. Something had to change. But how? He exhaled sharply, gripping the sink tighter. The answer wasn't clear yet, but the feeling inside him was. This wasn't just embarrassment. It was a breaking point. And for the first time in his life, Lucas wasn't sure he wanted to be the easy target anymore. Lucas walked aimlessly after school, his mind replaying the humiliation in the cafeteria over and over. His fists clenched at his sides as frustration bubbled inside him. He had spent years enduring Bruno's torment, convincing himself that silence was the safest response. But today felt different. He needed an escape. His feet carried him farther than usual, past familiar streets and into an older part of town. The buildings were worn, their walls covered in faded graffiti. He wasn't sure why he kept walking. Maybe he just didn't want to go home, to face his own reflection again. That's when he heard it. A sharp thud, followed by another, then a grunt, another impact. Curious, he followed the sounds until he reached a rusted metal door, slightly ajar. Inside, the dim lighting revealed an old gym. The air smelled of sweat and worn-out leather. The walls were lined with punching bags. And in the center, a cage stood like a battleground. Lucas barely had time to take it all in before a voice called out. "You lost, kid?" He turned sharply. A man stood by the ring, arms crossed. His presence was intimidating, broad shoulders, a rugged face marked by old scars, and a gaze that seemed to see right through him. Lucas hesitated. I was just watching." The man smirked. "Most people don't wander in here by accident." Lucas swallowed. He should have left. He didn't belong here. But something about this place, the raw energy, the sound of fists meeting pads, held him in place. The man studied him for a moment before speaking again. "Carlos," he said, offering no further explanation. Lucas nodded, unsure of what to say. Carlos motioned toward the fighters training nearby. "You ever thrown a punch before?" Lucas scoffed, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "Only when I was getting punched back." Carlos chuckled. "Honest, I like that." He leaned against the ring. "So? You looking for something or just sightseeing?" Lucas hesitated. Was he? His mind flashed back to Bruno, to the laughter, to the sick feeling of powerlessness. He didn't know much about fighting. He wasn't strong. He wasn't fast. But for the first time, he wanted to be. "I want to learn," he said, surprising even himself. Carlos raised an eyebrow. "Learning isn't easy. You willing to put in the work?" Lucas hesitated. He had never been good at sports. He was slow, out of shape. Wouldn't this be just another failure? But then he thought about the alternative, doing nothing, staying the same. "I am," he said, forcing confidence into his voice. Carlos studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right, kid. Show up tomorrow. Let's see what you've got." Lucas felt his heart race. He had no idea what he was getting himself into. But for the first time in a long while, he had hope. The gym smelled of sweat and old leather, the air thick with the sound of fists meeting pads. Lucas stood near the edge, shifting uncomfortably in his oversized hoodie. He had barely slept, his mind wrestling with doubts. What if this was a mistake? What if he failed? Carlos clapped his hands, snapping Lucas out of his thoughts. "All right, kid. Let's see what you're made of." Lucas swallowed hard as Carlos tossed him a pair of worn-out gloves. He slipped them on, feeling the weight of them, heavier than he expected. "First rule of fighting," Carlos said, circling him. "Strength means nothing if you don't know how to use it. Technique wins fights." Lucas nodded, unsure of what to expect. Carlos pointed to a heavy bag. "Hit it." Lucas took a deep breath and swung. His fist connected, but the impact was weak, sloppy. He grimaced. Carlos shook his head. Again. Lucas struck again, and again. His punches were wild, uncoordinated. The bag barely moved. His arms started to ache almost immediately. Carlos sighed. "You're trying to kill it. That's not how this works." He stepped behind Lucas, adjusting his stance. Feet shoulder-width apart, hands up. You don't just swing, you drive the punch from your whole body. Lucas tried again. His knuckles stung, but the punch felt better, more solid. Carlos nodded approvingly. "Better, but you've got a long way to go." The training continued, and with every failed attempt, frustration gnawed at Lucas. His muscles ached in places he hadn't known existed. Sweat dripped down his back. Each movement felt unnatural, forced. He wasn't cut out for this. After what felt like hours, Carlos finally called for a break. Lucas collapsed onto a bench, chest heaving. "You're weak," Carlos said bluntly. Lucas looked down, shame burning in his chest. He already knew that. "But," Carlos continued, "weak doesn't mean useless. It just means you haven't built strength yet." Lucas frowned. "What if I never do?" Carlos studied him for a moment. "Then you quit, like everyone else," he shrugged. "Or, you show up tomorrow and try again." Lucas hesitated. His body screamed for him to walk away. Every part of him wanted to quit, but something inside whispered, "Keep going." "I'll be here," he said, surprising himself. Carlos smirked. "Then maybe you've got something after all." Lucas exhaled, exhaustion settling into his bones. Today had been brutal, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't running away. This was just the beginning. Lucas felt the change before he could see it. His body was sore, his knuckles raw, but each morning he woke up feeling stronger. The workouts were grueling, push-ups until his arms gave out, punches until his fists throbbed, but he kept going. At school, the difference was subtle at first. His posture straightened. His steps felt firmer. He no longer hunched his shoulders or avoided eye contact. He still wasn't confident, far from it, but something inside him was shifting. Bruno noticed. It started with whispers. People glanced at Lucas in the hallways, their eyes lingering longer than before. It wasn't admiration, it was curiosity. Bruno didn't like curiosity. At lunch, Lucas barely had time to sit before he heard the familiar voice behind him. Well, look who's acting different." Lucas tensed but didn't flinch. He took a deep breath before turning. Bruno leaned against the table, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. His friend stood behind him, as always. "You got a little pep in your step, fatty. What happened? You find a magic diet pill?" Laughter followed. The old Lucas would have looked away, forced to chuckle, pretended it didn't hurt. Not today. Lucas met Bruno's gaze, his voice steady. "Leave me alone." The table fell silent. Even Bruno's friends hesitated. This was new. Bruno's smirk faltered for a split second before he scoffed. "Oh, you got a backbone now?" Lucas didn't answer. He didn't need to. Bruno leaned in. You think you're tough now? He laughed. Let's see how tough, you and me, a fight. The words hung in the air like a challenge neither could take back. Lucas felt his heart pound. His instinct screamed to back down. He wasn't ready, not yet. But he wasn't afraid anymore. He met Bruno's eyes and nodded. Fine. Gasps echoed around them. Someone whispered, no way. Bruno chuckled. You're serious? Lucas nodded again. Bruno tilted his head, studying him. Then a grin. All right then, this Friday, after school, the old basketball court. Lucas didn't hesitate. I'll be there. Bruno laughed, shaking his head. This is gonna be fun. He turned to his friends. You hear that? The fatty wants to fight. More laughter. But Lucas wasn't listening anymore. Because for the first time, he wasn't the joke. He was the challenge. Bruno's confidence was unshaken. He strutted through the halls like a king, soaking in the attention. Word of the fight had spread like wildfire, and now everyone was talking about it. Lucas was no longer invisible. People whispered as he passed, some with curiosity, others with amusement. Most assumed the outcome was inevitable. Bruno had the size, the reputation. Lucas was just the underdog, setting himself up for humiliation. But Bruno wasn't taking any chances. You sure this is a good idea? One of his friends, Victor, asked as they loitered behind the school. Bruno scoffed. What? You think I'm scared of him? Victor hesitated. He's different lately. What if... Bruno grabbed him by the collar, eyes narrowing. You think I'm gonna lose? Victor swallowed hard. No, man, of course not. Bruno let him go with a shove. Damn right. He exhaled sharply. But just in case, let's make sure he doesn't even make it to that fight. The plan was simple, cheap, effective. That afternoon, Lucas left the gym feeling exhausted but focused. The fight was in 2 days. Carlos had intensified his training, pushing him harder than ever. Every muscle in his body ached, but he was determined. He had come too far to turn back now. He was halfway home when he heard footsteps behind him. Too many. Lucas turned, just as Victor and 2 other guys stepped out of the alley. He recognized them immediately. Bruno's lackeys. His pulse quickened. Hey, Lucas, Victor said with a smirk. Got a minute? Lucas took a step back. Not interested. Victor sighed dramatically. Come on, man. We just want to talk. Lucas wasn't stupid. Before he could react, the first punch landed, a sharp blow to his ribs. He stumbled back, gasping. Another fist connected with his shoulder. Pain flared through his body, but something inside him snapped. Not again. The old Lucas would have curled up, taken the beating, let them walk away laughing. Not this time. He clenched his fists, his training kicked in. He shifted his stance, braced himself. The next guy lunged. Lucas dodged, then threw a punch straight into his gut. The boy doubled over with a grunt. Victor cursed. The hell? Lucas turned, just as another one swung at him. He blocked it clumsily, pain shooting up his arm, but he didn't stop. He shoved the guy back, making space. Victor hesitated. He hadn't expected this. Lucas breathed heavily, chest burning. He wasn't winning, but he wasn't losing either. Victor muttered a curse. Screw this. He's still standing. Let's go. With that, they retreated, disappearing into the alley. Lucas stayed where he was, his body aching, his breath uneven. His lip was bleeding, his ribs sore. But as he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, something dawned on him. Bruno was scared. Scared enough to send others to take him out before the fight. Lucas exhaled, steadying himself. They had tried to stop him, and they had failed. Lucas sat on the worn-out bench in the gym, wrapping his hands with slow, deliberate movements. His ribs ached. His lip was still slightly swollen, but he was here, still standing. Carlos watched him from across the room, arms crossed. So you gonna tell me why you're limping, or should I guess? Lucas exhaled. Bruno sent his guys after me. Carlos's expression darkened, but he didn't look surprised. And? Lucas met his gaze. I fought back. A small smirk tugged at Carlos's lips. Good. Lucas nodded, but the weight of tomorrow pressed on his chest. He had never been this close to a real fight before. Not one where people would be watching, expecting something. Do you think I can win? He asked. His voice was quieter than he intended. Carlos was silent for a moment before sitting beside him. Winning isn't just about landing the hardest punch. It's about control. The second you let emotions take over, you lose. Lucas frowned. What if I'm angry? Carlos sighed. Then use it, but don't let it use you. He turned to face him fully. Tell me, why are you fighting? Lucas hesitated. He had told himself it was for revenge, to shut Bruno up once and for all. But now, I don't know, he admitted. Carlos studied him before nodding. That's the difference between you and him. Bruno fights to prove he's in control. You're fighting to take back yours. Lucas let the words settle. Carlos stood. Tomorrow, don't fight like a kid trying to get even. Fight like someone who knows he doesn't need to. Lucas clenched his fists. He wanted to believe he could. Just then, the door creaked open. Lucas? He turned. Mariana stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her eyes flicking to his bruised face. Carlos gave her a knowing glance. I'll give you 2 minutes. He walked off, leaving them alone. Mariana stepped closer. I heard what happened. Lucas shrugged. I'm fine. She frowned. This isn't about being fine. She hesitated. Are you sure about this fight? Lucas met her gaze. I have to do it. Mariana bit her lip. Why? He wanted to tell her that it was about standing up for himself, proving he wasn't weak. But deep down, something felt off. Mariana sighed. I don't want you to turn into him. Lucas blinked. What? You're different, Lucas. But I've seen the way you've been looking at Bruno lately, like you want to hurt him as much as he hurt you. She hesitated. I don't want you to become someone you're not. Lucas looked away. The thought had never crossed his mind. Or had it? Mariana stepped back. Just be careful, okay? Lucas nodded slowly. As she left, he sat in silence. The gym felt heavier, the walls pressing in. Tomorrow he would fight. But now he wasn't sure if it was Bruno he was up against, or himself. The old basketball court behind the school was packed. Word of the fight had spread beyond what Lucas had expected. Dozens of students formed a tight circle around the cracked pavement, their voices buzzing with anticipation. Some whispered bets, others held their phones up, ready to record. Lucas stood at the edge of the crowd, stretching his sore arms. His ribs still ached from the ambush, but the pain didn't matter now. He focused on his breathing, steadying his heartbeat. Then the crowd parted. Bruno strode in, his smirk confident, his posture relaxed, as if this was nothing more than another game to him. His friends hyped him up, patting his shoulders, laughing. Lucas clenched his fists. He wasn't the same person Bruno had bullied for years. Carlos's words echoed in his mind. Control. Don't let your emotions decide this fight. Bruno stopped a few feet away, cracking his knuckles. Didn't think you'd actually show. Lucas met his gaze. I'm here. Bruno chuckled. All right then, fatty, let's get this over with. The words didn't sting this time. Someone in the crowd counted down. 3, 2, 1. Bruno lunged first, just as Lucas had expected. He swung hard, aiming for Lucas's jaw. But this time, Lucas wasn't an easy target. He dodged. Bruno stumbled slightly, caught off guard. The crowd gasped. Lucas kept his stance firm. He had no intention of throwing wild punches like Bruno. He waited. Bruno growled. He charged again, fists flying. Lucas blocked one hit, but the second caught him in the side. Pain flared through his ribs. Lucas gritted his teeth. Breathe. Stay calm. Bruno attacked again, throwing all his weight behind his punches. He was strong, but reckless. Lucas saw his opening. Bruno swung wide. Lucas ducked under it, stepped in, and struck. One clean punch to the ribs. Bruno grunted, staggering back. The crowd roared. Bruno's expression darkened. His arrogance cracked. He rushed forward, but Lucas was ready. He dodged left, jabbed, dodged right, jabbed again. Bruno's attacks became wilder, more desperate. Lucas stayed focused, his movements controlled. Then the moment came. Bruno swung with everything he had, but Lucas sidestepped. He caught Bruno's arm, twisted, and used his own momentum against him. Bruno lost his balance and crashed to the ground. Silence. Lucas stood over him, breathing heavily. Bruno rolled onto his back, dazed. Lucas could finish it, one more hit. He could humiliate him, make him feel everything he had felt for years. The crowd wanted it. They cheered, waiting for the final blow. Lucas clenched his fist, but then Mariana's voice echoed in his head. I don't want you to turn into him. His fist loosened. Bruno blinked up at him, confused, vulnerable. For the first time, Lucas saw what was underneath, the fear, the desperation to stay in control. Lucas stepped back. The crowd murmured. Bruno sat up, face red with anger. What? You scared? Lucas shook his head. I don't need to beat you to win. Bruno's mouth opened, but no words came out. Lucas turned and walked away, leaving the crowd in stunned silence. He had already won. The crowd's murmurs filled the empty space where fists should have landed. Lucas walked away from Bruno, his heart still hammering against his ribs. Every step felt heavier than the last, but he didn't look back. He had made his choice. Carlos was waiting near the edge of the court, arms crossed. His expression was unreadable. Lucas stopped in front of him, his breath still uneven. "You didn't finish him," Carlos said. Lucas wiped the sweat from his forehead. "I didn't need to." Carlos studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good." Lucas exhaled, finally allowing himself to relax. His entire body ached. The fight had been short, but it felt like it had lasted forever. Bruno was still sitting on the ground, his face contorted with frustration. His pride had been shattered, not by fists, but by something far worse. Defeat without humiliation. The crowd started to dissipate, disappointed that they hadn't gotten the brutal spectacle they had hoped for. Some muttered, others laughed. But Lucas noticed something strange. No one was mocking him. They looked at him differently now, not as a victim, not as an easy target, but as someone who had stood his ground. Mariana approached cautiously, her eyes scanning his bruised face. "Are you okay?" Lucas nodded, though his ribs throbbed. "Yeah." She gave him a small smile. "You did the right thing." Lucas wasn't sure if it felt like the right thing yet, but hearing her say, it made it easier to believe. Behind them, Bruno stood, his face twisted into a sneer as he brushed dirt off his clothes. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. Lucas turned, meeting his gaze. "No," he said simply, "but I do." Bruno opened his mouth to retort, but nothing came out. He clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. But for the first time, there was hesitation in his stance. Lucas had expected more. One last insult, another attempt to reassert dominance, but it didn't come. Bruno turned and shoved past his friends, disappearing into the dispersing crowd. Lucas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was over. Or maybe it was just beginning. That night, Lucas lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His body ached, but his mind was restless. He kept replaying the fight in his head, the rush of adrenaline, the sound of his own breathing, the moment he had stepped away. Had he done the right thing? A part of him had wanted to finish it, to let Bruno feel the humiliation he had endured for years. Wouldn't that have been justice? But then, would he have been any different? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Carlos had been right. Fighting wasn't about proving strength. It was about control. And tonight, for the first time, he had chosen control. The next morning at school, everything felt different. People whispered, but not with the usual sneers. A few students even nodded at him in acknowledgement. It wasn't admiration, it was respect. Mariana caught up with him in the hallway. "You look tired." Lucas chuckled. "Didn't sleep much." She tilted her head. "Regretting your decision?" He shook his head. "No, just thinking." Mariana smiled. "You made a choice, Lucas. That's more than most people ever do." He thought about that as he walked to his locker. Bruno was nowhere to be seen. His absence wasn't celebrated, nor was it questioned. The school had already moved on, as it always did. But Lucas knew that Bruno wouldn't forget. Neither would he. As he reached for his books, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Hey," Lucas turned. It was Victor, one of Bruno's usual followers. He shifted awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. Just wanted to say, that was pretty crazy yesterday." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Yeah?" Victor hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, you handled yourself well." Lucas didn't know what to say. The same guys who had jumped him days ago were now, what? Respecting him? Victor glanced around. "Anyway, just wanted to say that." Then he walked off. Lucas closed his locker, exhaling. Everything had changed. Later that evening, Lucas returned to the gym. Carlos was already there, working the punching bag. The rhythmic thud-thud of his fists echoed through the space. Lucas set his bag down, stretching his sore arms. Carlos didn't stop as he spoke. "So what now?" Lucas hesitated. That was the real question, wasn't it? For so long he had thought of this fight as an ending, the moment he stopped being a victim. But now he saw it differently. This wasn't the end. It was just another step. "I want to keep training," Lucas said. "For real this time." Carlos finally stopped, turning to face him. He studied Lucas carefully before nodding. "Good." Lucas smiled. Think I could actually compete someday? Carlos smirked. That depends. On what? Carlos tossed him a pair of gloves. How hard you're willing to work. Lucas grinned, slipping them on. His muscles ached, his body protested, but none of that mattered. Because for the first time in his life, he was in control. And he wasn't stopping now. Lucas's fist struck the heavy bag in steady rhythm. Thud, thud, thud. Sweat dripped down his forehead, soaking into his shirt, but he didn't stop. His breath was controlled, his stance solid. Each punch felt more natural, more precise. Carlos stood nearby, arms crossed, observing. He didn't offer praise, but he didn't need to. Lucas had learned that silence meant approval. After months of training, his body had transformed. His arms were stronger, his legs more stable, his endurance sharper. But it wasn't just the physical changes. Something deeper had shifted. His mindset, his discipline. He was no longer the same Lucas who had walked into this gym months ago, unsure and desperate. He belonged here now. Carlos finally spoke. All right, that's enough for today. Lucas exhaled sharply, stepping back from the bag. His muscles burned, but he welcomed the pain. Carlos tossed him a towel. You've come a long way, kid. Lucas wiped his face, nodding. Feels like it. Carlos studied him for a moment before leaning against the ring. So, what's next? Lucas frowned. What do you mean? Carlos smirked. You didn't come here just to punch bags forever. You want more. Lucas hesitated. He did want more. He had been training relentlessly, but for what? At first, it had been about Bruno, about proving he wasn't weak, but that was over. He had won that fight without throwing the final punch. Now his reason had to be bigger than revenge. Carlos seemed to read his thoughts. There's a tournament coming up, he said. Amateur MMA, local circuit. Lucas's pulse quickened, a real fight, against real competitors. He swallowed. You think I'm ready? Carlos tilted his head. You tell me. Lucas hesitated, then squared his shoulders. I want to do it. Carlos nodded. Good, but understand this. This won't be like fighting some schoolyard bully. These guys train to win. I'm not scared, Lucas said, more for himself than for Carlos. Carlos chuckled. Fear isn't the problem, overconfidence is. He crossed his arms. You've got 2 months to prepare. That's not a lot of time. Lucas took a deep breath. Then we start now. Carlos grinned. That's what I wanted to hear. Training became more intense. Lucas had thought he was pushing his limits before, but now Carlos demanded more. More drills, more sparring, more exhaustion. His knuckles bruised, his body ached, but he didn't complain. Carlos introduced new challenges. Wrestling drills that left him gasping for breath. Grappling techniques that had him tapping out within seconds. MMA wasn't just about striking. It was about control, endurance, adaptability. One night, after an especially grueling session, Lucas collapsed onto the mat, staring at the ceiling. Carlos sat beside him. Tired? Lucas let out a breathless laugh. Completely. Carlos smirked. Good. Lucas turned his head toward him. What was your first fight like? Carlos's expression darkened slightly. Messy, he exhaled. I was too aggressive. Thought I could just swing my way to victory. I won, but barely. I took too much damage. Lucas frowned. So what changed? Carlos gave him a look. I learned control. Lucas nodded, letting the words sink in. This wasn't just about being the strongest. It was about being the smartest. As the tournament approached, the pressure mounted. Lucas had never felt nerves like this before. In school, fights were chaotic, unstructured. Here, there were rules, expectations. The names of the competitors were released a week before the event. Carlos handed Lucas the list. One name stood out, Matthias Rocha. Lucas's stomach twisted. He had heard of Matthias before, an undefeated amateur fighter known for his brutal takedowns and relentless pace. Carlos watched his reaction. He's tough, Lucas swallowed. Yeah, Carlos leaned in. That doesn't mean he's unbeatable. Lucas exhaled, nodding. Then let's make sure I'm ready. The night before the fight, Lucas found himself in the gym alone. He stood in front of the mirror, wrapping his hands slowly, deliberately. His reflection stared back at him, stronger, sharper, ready. But was he? Doubt crept in, unwanted. What if I lose? He shook his head. He had come too far to second-guess himself now. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. You always do this before big fights? Lucas turned. Mariana leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. He smiled. First big fight, so I guess the answer is yes. She stepped closer, looking him over. "You're really doing this?" He nodded. "Yeah." She hesitated. "Why?" Lucas sighed. "Because I need to know how far I can go." Mariana studied him before nodding. "Then go all the way." Lucas smiled. "That's the plan." Fight day. The tournament was held in a packed gymnasium, the energy electric. Fighters warmed up in different corners, the sounds of punches hitting pads echoing through the space. Lucas paced back and forth, shaking out his arms. His heart pounded, but his breathing stayed steady. Carlos stood beside him. "You ready?" Lucas met his gaze. "Yeah." Carlos clapped his shoulder. "Then get in there and show them who you are." Lucas stepped into the cage. Across from him, Matthias Rocha stood, his stance relaxed, confident. His eyes were sharp, assessing. The referee called them forward. Lucas inhaled deeply. Then the bell rang. Matthias moved fast. Lucas barely had time to react before Matthias closed the distance, his fists flying. Lucas dodged, blocked, countered, but Matthias was relentless. A sharp kick connected with Lucas's ribs. Pain shot through him, but he gritted his teeth and pushed forward. He wasn't just here to survive, he was here to fight. Lucas countered with a jab, then a hook. Matthias absorbed the hits, but Lucas saw something in his eyes. Surprise. He wasn't an easy target. The fight became a war. Matthias went for a takedown, but Lucas sprawled, stuffing it. He wasn't letting this fight go to the ground. Seconds felt like minutes. Every exchange drained them both, but Lucas refused to back down. Then an opening. Matthias overextended on a punch. Lucas saw it, reacted instinctively. A clean right hook. Matthias staggered. Lucas didn't hesitate. He followed up with a flurry of strikes, pushing forward, controlling the fight. The referee watched closely. Matthias was struggling to defend. Lucas saw the moment his opponent realized it. He was losing. One final punch. Matthias fell. The referee stepped in. "Stop!" The fight was over. For a moment, Lucas just stood there, chest heaving, sweat dripping from his brow. The roar of the crowd barely registered. Then it hit him. He had won. Carlos rushed into the cage, clapping him on the back. "Hell of a fight, kid." Lucas grinned, barely believing it himself. Matthias sat up, shaking his head. Then, to Lucas's surprise, he extended his hand. Lucas hesitated, then took it. Respect. As he stepped out of the cage, Mariana was waiting, a proud smile on her face. "You did it." Lucas exhaled. "Yeah." But he knew this was just the beginning, because the real fight wasn't about winning. It was about how far he was willing to go, and he was just getting started. In the end, Lucas didn't just learn how to fight. He learned that true strength isn't about overpowering others, but about mastering himself. He had the chance to humiliate Bruno, to take revenge, but instead, he chose control over chaos. Because real power isn't in proving others wrong, it's in proving to yourself that you are more than their words, more than their expectations. So, what would you have done in his place? Would you have taken the final punch or walked away stronger? Click the video on the screen to continue this journey of self-discovery and see what it really takes to turn weakness into strength. And if you're ready to keep growing, make sure to subscribe for more stories that push you to think, to challenge yourself,